Welcome back to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Very pleased to be joined by a team of folks from CyberVista, which is a cybersecurity training company. Welcome to the show, my friends and colleagues.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
For having us.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm joined by Simone, Jung, and Sam. Simone is the CEO of CyberVista. Jung is the Chief Product Officer, and Sam works in product management with Jung. And hopefully we're going to be able to get some different perspectives from each of you. And again, it would be wonderful if it's a free-flowing, comfortable conversation, which is what we always aim for. I think I'll begin with you, Simone. So can you tell our listeners a little bit of your backstory? What got you into cybersecurity? How you landed with CyberVista, and then I think we'll go around the horn a bit.
Sure. So I got into cybersecurity in 2005,
Wow.
but my background actually was originally in counterterrorism. So I actually worked for the Department of Defense after graduating from grad school, and was really focused on the counterterrorism mission, tracking down terrorists. And when I left and started doing some contracting work in 2005, I ended up supporting the intelligence community and started supporting what was then computer network operations. So it was primarily an intelligence mission. So we were looking at how do you identify what are the bigger threats and vulnerabilities to DoD information systems. So it was not cyber yet. It actually didn't become cybersecurity until 2007. And that was a result of the Comprehensive National Cybersecurity Initiative, which dumped a huge amount of money into the nation to protect our infrastructure and, cyber assets. And really, so had been doing that ever since, and took that intelligence community experience and supported the intelligence community in a variety of different functions, all within the cybersecurity realm for the better part of the next decade, and then moved into working with commercial companies who were then starting to realize that they had massive cybersecurity problems on their hands too.
Got it.
And the financial services sector has a huge amount of vulnerabilities, and they are essentially critical infrastructure. And so what happens when they have to put together programs that protect them from these kind of cyber risks?
Yep.
So that was my background. I come from the cyber industry. And, I got into CyberVista, one of our founders. And the reason for that was because I myself had a massive talent issue. I had over 100 analysts that worked for me at its peak in the intelligence community and the contracts we supported there. And I had a constant talent churn problem. I couldn't find the right people that were qualified. If I did, I had to actually train them up on my own. Once I trained them up on my own, they'd come back to me and it'd be like 18 months later and they'd say, "Thank you so much for this experience. I just got a job offer with competitor X, Y, or Z, and it's 30% more." And I'd be like, "I can't do that."
Right.
So I was very acutely familiar with the problem. And when the opportunity came along to really think about how we could fuse best practices and innovations in education and learning, which I knew nothing about, with my understanding of where employers and the problem really lies, that was an incredibly compelling problem, and I really wanted to kind of be part of helping to solve that.
And that's what really brought you to
Totally.
CyberVista. And yeah, it's fascinating background, and we'll definitely want to circle back on some of that, because whatever you're able to share, because it sounds like there'd be some really fascinating stories, especially going back into the early 2000s, which is kind of like the Wild West. Yeah, exactly. And then shifting over to you, Jung, can you tell a little bit of your origin story as a CyberVistan?
No, I'd be happy to. I'm happy to be back at the Kaplan office, because my origin story in learning actually starts with me having joined the MCAT team back in the early 2000s. So Mike and you and I go way back in terms of knowing, going into back to the working together. So this is good to be back at the old Kaplan mothership.
Yeah,
so,
and just on that, we could tell some stories. They just would be a lot more boring. So we won't do that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So in terms of how I got to cybersecurity, it's very similar to a lot of how the other people in the cybersecurity have gotten to where they are, which is at varies. So I actually, after Kaplan's experience, I went to business school thinking that I was going to do educational. And so in some ways I was going to, work in the education field that's similar to Kaplan. But I took a bit of a turn and decided to work for a hedge fund for about 8 years.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the world where I got to sort of learn about the risk management, how to actually handle very important assets,
Sure.
money, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And but that for some reason did not work out. So we don't have enough time to talk about that.
Sure.
But during that time, one of the founders of CyberVista came calling. We used to work together at Kaplan, and said, "Are you interested in helping us develop programs in that cybersecurity education?" Now, I knew a lot about how to build courses. What I did not know was about cybersecurity. So I actually had to talk to a lot of different people, including Simone, who drew me, to this day, it's seared in my brain, a beautiful drawing about how all the cybersecurity forces are dependent on each other. So that, along with a lot of studying, got me up to speed. And initially I was very, very hesitant to join the world because I didn't really know a lot about it. But what I found out is that there's a lot of folks in cybersecurity who've changed their jobs to be in that. And that was an eye-opening moment for me. And it also enabled me to be able to assert myself in terms of how to actually best solve this, not only the training issue, but actually how to actually bring about a significant changes in workforce shortages that's happening.
Yeah.
So that's how I came to CyberVista and cybersecurity.
Awesome. And to your credit, I think you demonstrated that these skills are learnable because you're someone who came from outside of the cyber industry. And now, imposter syndrome aside, you're an expert. So good job by you. And then rounding it out, Sam, we wanted to get your perspective. What brought you to cybersecurity and to CyberVista in particular?
So actually, to echo kind of Jung's background, I don't have a background in cybersecurity, non-IT background. I was actually a history major and started my career in strategic communications, crisis communications, and speech writing. So in fact, when I told my mom I was going to be on the podcast, she was like, "Is it a Civil War podcast or baseball?" I was like, well, something else actually. So I explained to Jung my job interview. I just think that good writing is simply good teaching or good explaining, and good teaching is universal no matter what the subject is. So that's how I found myself here in the cybersecurity world, and I do product innovation at CyberVista, and happy to be here.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic, and it's. I think Simone, you mentioned even back in the day. The skills were changing very fast. Talent was at a premium. Talent was fluid too; it would move around. So that's still the case today, I would imagine. And I'd like, in some ways, that's why CyberVista exists. So can you talk a little bit about the talent gap, the skills gap that exists? Because maybe it's more a skills gap than a talent gap. But I'd love to hear you, just sort of lay out the current state of play.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of both. The talent gap exists because there are, 3 million positions worldwide that are just unfilled because they don't have the people to fill them.
Yep.
And then if you look at a litany of studies that came out, a good chunk or percentage of companies, in fact, one recent study in 2019 found that a third of companies identified that a full 25% of their workforces were just unqualified for the positions they were in.
Wow. Okay.
So it's both.
Yeah.
And the state of being, I think, is you do have to kind of go back to the history of the evolution of cybersecurity as a field. And, when I first got into it, the roles that we had then are different than what they are now. I was in the threat intelligence space. That was not an area that was actually considered a traditional information assurance role. It was a technical role, and we were doing something different. Today, threat intelligence is commonplace. It's a very widely accepted job role, but now we have these further types of roles called threat hunters, and those didn't exist 5 years ago. So as the field matures, it's starting to get more specialized. And in getting more specialized, it's creating more areas that you need different types of niche skill sets to fill it. But it's all getting defined as we're creating the positions.
Right.
So if you haven't even defined the positions, how can you actually, the training and education is the lagging indicator in all of that. And so it takes a long time to have those things catch up. And as they start to catch up, and we saw this in particular with university systems and traditional education, by the time they build out or develop or deploy a program,
right,
new jobs have evolved. And so they're teaching to, computer security a la 5 years prior.
Yeah, exactly. And then as we were talking during our prep, as new technologies emerge, like brain computer interfaces as an example, that's a new component that is hackable, is attackable, and hopefully the frameworks are flexible enough to kind of adapt, but the actual skills need to be retrained because they're probably different than what they were before.
Right. I think the other thing that you're seeing increase, especially in the private sector, is just how much the roles that are required to be successful in any business are the undercutting or the underpinnings of technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you're going to be in a technology business, and arguably every business out there is currently in the technology business,
Yes.
that means that there needs to be a security component that gets built into it too.
Right.
So the distinctions even between cyber professional roles versus who needs to do cybersecurity work as part of their other job role is getting really blurred.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And that's kind of what I meant around the talent. In some ways, the talent or maybe just like the core competencies are there. It's just people haven't been trained in cyber. Yeah. And that's the thing that I think is interesting. And that's why, pivoting a little bit to you, Jung, like you're an example of that, where like you had the talent, you hadn't applied your sort of natural ability to learn things to cyber. So this skills gap that's there, it's a problem, but it is also an opportunity in that if we could identify the types of people who would either be a professional or would develop the competencies that someone who's a professional in another field would need, that seems like a big opportunity. And I'd love to hear you sort of talk a little bit about that, both in terms of how do we train professionals, but also what kind of competencies could be developed for other folks who maybe aren't officially going to be hired into a cyber role, all those adjacent roles that need the competencies that Simone was talking about.
Sure. I'll actually answer your second question first, which is a competency part. And in some ways, there was a study that we conducted with some of the consulting firm in terms of their workforce development. And time after, and I apologize, I'm not saying that correctly, what we got consistently is a better word to use, consistently from the people who are looking for very, very high level cybersecurity folks were not prowess of technical knowledge, but critical thinking. And a good communication skills, being able to recognize how to actually formulate your communication so that it actually fits whoever you're talking to, whether it's a customer, whether it's a technical person, whether it's senior management. Those are actually, is there any other skill do you remember from the conversation, Simone?
Yeah, I also remember they talked about, like how can you distill a requirement and synthesize it into what problem you're trying to solve in order to then structure the right approach. So that kind of synthesis of what are you trying to answer versus then how do you actually interpret the results.
Which is interesting too, because those are sort of quote unquote higher level thinking, and lots of times maybe like a rudimentary understanding of cybersecurity is like, it's very sort of map this thing to this thing, and like very like sort of almost lower level technical. And it's really interesting too, because another theme that comes up on the show a lot is automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning. I imagine those types of tools are relevant in identifying cyber threats and sort of doing some of the things that maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago was done by humans. So any thoughts on that?
No, absolutely. I think that is exactly what's happening. In order to be able to be a good cybersecurity defender or investigator, you really have to understand one discipline of cybersecurity and be able to blend it with the other discipline. So social engineering along with the technical skills, database skills, along with being able to understand what type of attacks that's available. So a lot of interconnecting is required, because from the defensive perspective, you actually have to be aware of thousands of different connections. But from the attackers or hackers perspective, all they have to do is make one connection work.
Right.
So that's a critical skill that we're finding it out. So we're recognizing that this is a skill that's sort of not a skill, and I'll even say aptitude that you sort of need to bring to the table. Now, training part, and Mike, you and I go way back in terms of training pieces. I mean, when I used to work on MCAT and the GRE programs, we had to build programs to be able to teach. And I know you also taught psychology back in the day.
Yeah.
So it's gathering the materials and sort of presenting in a way that is very, very accessible. Now, something that I found creating training pieces for cybersecurity is that you really have to create this for everybody, not just the sort of technical people. And I think that I sort of referred to it in the earlier part of my introduction, is that people who are in this cybersecurity space come from varied backgrounds. So the assumption is that start from this beginning and then just bring it up very, very quickly. And that's been very, very helpful in terms of creating the courses. And being able to have all that library of knowledge to be able to transfer, that's also been very, very helpful.
Yeah.
And I actually want to throw it to Sam just to see if there's anything that you want to add about building training courses.
I think the interesting thing is those soft skills that Jung and Simone mentioned earlier that all the employers are looking for. The reason why they're looking for them is actually, in a way, they're harder to learn. They're harder to teach. So in a weird way, the technical skills, we think we have like a roadmap and a formula for actually teaching it. And the nice part about cybersecurity in particular is that, it's not overly arcane. So obviously it's very technical, but it makes a lot of sense. A lot of it is common sense. So I think as long as people are thinking about it in the right way, it's actually very approachable. And there's so many different various fields that you can draw connections to cybersecurity. So for example, an obvious one is healthcare. So like in the same way that you wouldn't leave a wound, open on a patient, you wouldn't leave unpatched software on a device or a computer. So, and that is just one easy example. And there are so many other numerous examples, not only in healthcare, but across multiple fields.
Yeah, and it does tie to the narrative aspect of cyber that I think is really interesting, and sort of the allegorical aspect of it too, where like people want to understand these complex fields, and frequently the way you make them more accessible is to analogize, and that was Sam bringing up healthcare, I think is a really good angle. You got something to add?
Yeah, there's the only thing that I wanted to add, which is that when you approach any other subject like MCAT or science or anything else, there's been a lot of predefined areas of high voltage you have to, like there's a biology you have to understand, you have to understand chemistry, you have to understand physics, you also have to understand this and that. Now, when we actually started to create courses for CyberVista, what we recognize is that there has not been well-defined subjects. And one of the things that we really had to do was define what individual silos were and what topics go into it. Now, National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, NICE, has done a phenomenal job of listing out all of the, we'll call it KSET, knowledge, skills, abilities and tasks.
Yeah.
Thank you. And what unfortunately for us from the training perspective, it was just a list without any precedence and in terms of what you need to know to get to the next level. So what we had to do initially at CyberVista was lay that all of that, and there are about 1,600 of them. We laid that out in an organization so that we could use to be able to create not only the framework and what we call taxonomy, just to wonk out a little bit.
Wonk away.
But to be able to organize in a way that we could create content for. So that's something that we're very, very proud of at CyberVista.
Yeah, and Jung is being a little modest there, because when we actually interviewed different employers about asking kind of what skills was most relevant to the most important job roles, we got a lot of different answers. So not only could they not agree on the skills or the knowledge, they couldn't even agree on what to call a certain job role. So the field is in worse shape than you think.
Right. Right. And even the idea, getting back to that previous topic of like just cyber literacy or fluency in the domain, maybe for you, Simone, in particular, when you're talking to a leader in industry, how do you navigate that when you're trying to explain pretty technical concepts to someone who may not be technical at all, yet they're also responsible for significant investments around making sure that their data is secure and that they're avoiding risk?
I think there's two kind of folds to that answer. The first is that if you're talking to an executive that ultimately is responsible for overseeing the budget, but they've often delegated to someone who is more technical, what you have to focus on with them is educating them and making them literate in how cybersecurity is a component of their overall business risk. And if you can tie it into terms of risk, then that's a language that most business people at many levels understand, because that is their job function. And so this is just another facet of that risk. Now, then the business case challenge becomes, how do you quantify that? How do you actually put that into dollars and cents terms so that you can make some determining factors?
Right.
And that's where they'll turn to often the technical person, or if you're a smaller company, an outsourced provider,
Right.
and try and kind of read the tea leaves and understand, well, if I make this investment for $250,000, is that going to save me $250,000 in loss, or I will never know?
Right.
And I would say that, you know, those who don't have technical backgrounds aren't really able to answer that question, because it's hard to evaluate whether a technology solution will truly effectuate that. You can't guarantee that it's going to stop a breach.
Right.
And the technical experts that they rely on struggle to put that into business terms, because you can't guarantee that you're going to prevent a certain amount of loss.
Right. Right. It's interesting because it's almost like buying insurance, right? So like if you buy the insurance, you don't, except even more so, I guess it's, you're trying to be proactive against risk. And I think frequently when people think about cybersecurity, it winds up being reactive. So like when you war game a scenario, and I've been through some of those tabletop trainings, it's frequently like, something just happened, what do you do?
Yeah.
And I think frequently, I think to get out ahead of that, you know, it's almost like loss aversion. You have to get people to think about, you don't want to be like this example. Can you talk a little bit about like what those conversations are like?
Yeah, I think it comes down to understanding what is the most important component to your business. I actually, as a tangent, I think this is where a lot of security professionals sometimes fail, is because they tend to take themselves out of the context of what their role is within the business and what their business is trying to achieve. But it's incredibly important to be able to first define what makes us special. What are our crown jewels? Is the crown jewel your customers and therefore their data, and you have to keep that secure, because if they lose trust, then you have no business.
Right.
Look at like what's happening with Facebook and social media right now, and those tech giants. Is your business around health data and protecting health data, right? Like that really matters.
Right.
Even an example like UPS, that's kind of my favorite example. Like everyone says, well, that's a logistics company. But it's not. It's a technology company, because they actually, like every one of those trucks has sensors all over it that's collecting every movement of a driver. If they back up, if they make a wrong turn, if they have to turn around, it's all captured in the name of, you know, just massing amounts of data so they can make package delivery more efficient and faster.
Right.
And so when you think about like what is the most important thing to your business, you have to triage the initiatives you're going to take in that perspective. If you don't, you're going to throw good money after bad.
Right.
It's not going to be impactful, and you're not going to ultimately contribute to lowering that risk profile.
Yeah.
You know, no insurance policy is going to save you from that.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And then a lot of this, I think, you know, if you think about wargaming or like scenario-based thinking, that's very central to training folks, right? So like, how do you anticipate new unexpected threats and breaches? And one of the ways you do that is just by taking those reps, getting the practice that's needed to sort of be exposed to, well, here's what happened at UPS and here's what happened to this healthcare company. Can you talk a little bit about that, Jung? Because I know that's a big part of what cybersecurity training frequently is. Like it's almost like that wargaming, scenario-based thinking that increasingly, as I do research and do shows, like it's becoming much more relevant to develop that scenario-based thinking and that mindset of being responsive, even if the scenarios that you're exposed to are not going to be an exact fit when faced with a novel challenge. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right in terms of the kind of people that we need to have in these critical cybersecurity areas are the people who actually can think well in those critical situations. When your incident does happen, breach does happen, they have to be able to come up with a good way to get around that. So there's nothing like a good practice run to make that happen. And so there's a lot of movement to make sure that there's a lot of good scenarios for them to practice with. Like, business school case study really can be modified a little bit for a cybersecurity professional and say, look, you know what, we just got a breach and now they have a hold of the CEO's email account. What are you going to do?
Right.
And so there are a lot of that's actually built in to some of our courses. Now, having said that, what I've also been finding out from the works that I've been done with enterprises is that we also need to fill the gaps at the very bottom. When I say bottom, meaning you have to make sure that anybody who works in cybersecurity, forget people who are in the adjacent roles, understand different things that's happening. Because right now, as we sort of started the conversation about the workforce shortage, we're finding even big gaps, even in sort of the basic cybersecurity roles.
Right.
So I wanted to sort of fill that up first as we're moving along, but for the higher level courses, for sure, it's critical for them to be able to do, not only just to capture the flag, but understand the business consequence and even like a social consequence behind how to actually sort of make sure that you plug this hole, especially for somebody who actually works in medical devices.
Right.
If they do not fix that correctly, then somebody does really get hurt.
Yeah. And it's, it reminds me a little bit of what you were talking about, Simone, too, where like a good, and I think you and I have talked about this previously, Jung, like a good cybersecurity professional has competencies in the domains that they're serving. And if they don't, they're at least able to understand what's different about UPS versus a healthcare company, and where, just so that you almost think like enterprise risk manager. And that's, I think that's like a next level thing to take away for our listeners too, is like that mindset shift is something we could all benefit from. And it's also interesting to think about folks maybe later in their careers who are trying to understand how to stay job relevant. In some ways, the harder part is getting the depth within your field and then addressing like ramping up on the cyber skills afterwards. It's just a different way to think about, who might be able to fill the more senior analyst roles.
Yeah, no, context matters. I think that's true in any field, not just cybersecurity. And so being able to have people that understand the technical ramifications, but tie it to the overall narrative of what you're trying to protect is important. And that is something that, someone who has a career-long history in financial services brings to bear a whole lot of understanding of that particular industry that even a 8-year cybersecurity professional who's served in a different vertical would have no idea. And so I think that there are lots of ways that you can see some of those adjacent roles become more relevant.
Yep.
Because you're then drawing from technical experts that might be more agnostic to a career of experience, but they need those translators and they need those that can help tell those stories.
Yeah, exactly. And like the idea of, not being too narrowly expert in the field. Like there is, obviously you need those competencies, but like if you are exclusively focused on the cybersecurity competencies without understanding that context, that's actually dangerous.
Yeah, well, and it brings up another interesting challenge that the cybersecurity field has right now, which is around, career pathways and how does someone get into a role, and how do they establish themselves as an expert, but then they often find themselves tapping out quickly. You kind of reach your own mini ceiling, and there's really very little room for progression. And the industry hasn't been able to really define what it means to go from one of those roles into an adjacent role. How do you get a broad base of experience? What does that then mean for your career progression and your professional development? And certainly what keeps you, as an individual engaged, dynamic, feel like you're actually, learning across the field. Because like many things, that context is what you gain from experience.
Right.
And you can't just, there are very few things where you get to stay in a, 1 inch wide, mile deep hole for the rest of your career.
Yeah. And then just pivoting a little bit to maybe the narrative aspect, maybe bring Sam back in, and then I'd love to hear from all of you on this. Cyber also seems very much in the collective consciousness, or the zeitgeist, as I like to say. So what examples are out there that are good in the popular culture that it really helped elevate the understanding? And then what are some of the more dangerous examples, or just bad ways of understanding this? Because I know frequently pop culture gets it wrong. So as the English major in the room, or near the room, any thoughts on that? Like, just from a narrative, like what makes a compelling piece of pop culture or news story that everybody thinks about, and which of those jump to mind that are good, and which of them jump to mind that maybe are perpetuating myths or bad understandings?
So Mike, just to clarify, I'm the history major.
Oh, history major, but you write well. Sorry, there you go.
Well, hey, the only difference between an English major and history major is that we write about stuff that actually happened.
There you go.
That's the way I think about it.
Well done.
And you can tell I'm not an English major because I didn't know that big fancy word started with a Z that you threw out.
Zeitgeist.
I'm glad you clarified the question.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you asked the follow-on question, which is, the whole concept of dangerous narratives or misleading, right?
Yep.
And I think the biggest one, and actually this is something that another fellow former CyberVista employee, Amjad, was talking about when he was on your show a while ago. He was explaining that in popular culture, we show breach and hacks happening within seconds, right? And of course, the reality is, from the attacker's perspective, this is a very, very long, drawn-out process. So, but of course, that has consequences for the victim as well. So one of the major things to be thinking about is when you discover that you've been breached, oftentimes the hacker will actually be in your system, or the intruder will kind of be in your critical database or in your network for months, if not years. So the damage is actually greater than you would think. So I think that's the one big takeaway of, hey, this stuff takes longer. Because of that, it's longer to actually discover. And you really have to have a good incident response team that's good at quantifying the damage based on how long the attacker's been in your system.
Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me of the whole horror movie. The calls are coming from inside your house. So like when you discover the hacker, they're probably still in there.
And they've been there for a while.
Exactly. Any other thoughts in terms of just pop culture, or that was really interesting, Sam. So I appreciate that, especially for a history major.
Yeah, I wish I had some good pop culture examples. I kind of have mostly bad ones. If anyone saw CSI Cyber, terrible example. I think that right now, where pop culture has gotten it right, and I don't think there's an example, but I think they've gotten it right at the macro level because it's become a common term. If I started talking about breaches and general cybersecurity, like what I did 7 years ago, I mean, eyes glazed over immediately. And now pretty much anyone you meet on the street has read an article because they are routinely on the front page of every, mainstream publication that reports on this. Everyone has like a security and information technology beat.
Right.
So they've succeeded there. Where I think that pop culture hasn't helped is when you think about like even the talent gap, they've kind of done a disservice to making it a cool field to enter. There was a really interesting statistic I saw that, the average age of an information risk professional in the federal government, so this is specific to the government, is currently 64.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Because they've been in that forever. And like the percentage of millennials that are in these fields in the federal government is like under 11%.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's huge. So how do you attract more people into the field? Pop culture can be incredibly compelling in helping to make a field sexy.
Right.
When West Wing came out, everyone was going to go into politics, everything. When Law and Order came out, everyone was going to be a lawyer. And they didn't care that, they made it look like a trial and all the prep could happen in, 40-minute episode.
Sure.
You still have to do all the legwork.
Right.
So I think there have been a lot. I think that's something that pop culture still needs to get right.
Yeah.
They need to make it more accessible. And they need to allow people to see themselves in the roles more than they have. Because right now the trope is like someone in their basement in a hoodie.
Yes. Mr. Robot.
It's all Mr. Robot all the time.
Pounds.
Yeah. And like those are particular roles within this field, but they're not the only roles.
Right. Right. And also I think even in the example of Mr. Robot, which is the one that I always gravitate to nowadays, because I still feel like there are many stories that need to be told, and Mr. Robot seems to have gotten the collective attention, but it was really more making the hacker side sexy. And like, when you think about CSI, there still seems like a missed opportunity, like turning this into even this is the whole screenplay that we can work on, but like the actual espionage angle, which is honestly playing forth in the public theater of our pop culture and our national political spectrum these days.
Those are synonymous now.
Oh my God, yeah, exactly. But it's really, I mean, and then compound that with the fact that every company is pursuing an AI strategy, which is a data strategy. It does seem like this gap's going to continue to grow, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not going away anytime soon. I mean, so certainly job security and opportunities for anyone that wants to get into it.
Yeah.
But I also think that's where it ties to, I mean, part of, our commitment when we work with companies, and part of the reason that we specifically work with companies is, when you think about increasing the people that come into the field, that is education institutions' responsibility to get people ready. And there's a whole host of things that still need to be done around like K through 12. How do you get more kids interested in computer science and STEM and just understanding technology? But we don't afford to wait for them to actually come up through the systems. And so when we look at it, we're like, how do we take people that are in the workforce today that see the opportunity there, show them that there is a path for them, and get them up to speed on the technical things that they can be successful in order to meet this big demand.
Yeah.
Because we're not solving this problem by just putting out what we have. No universities are going to solve it just by kind of creating a new pipeline.
Yeah.
And like, there's just not one silver bullet to this, to this issue.
Yeah. Which is an opportunity, obviously. And then also it requires some flexibility and creativity, I guess, to respond to like really an ever-changing industry. We're coming close to time, so I always like to ask our guests what trends they're noticing, either within cybersecurity or just more broadly as a learning and education company. And actually, this is a learning and education show, so that's a toss-up. So I don't know if anyone has any ideas. Jung, you're making eye contact. Do you have any thoughts?
So I have two things. One is that there's a cybersecurity right education in general right now has been mostly done in boot camp in 5-day models. That's literally has been how people's been learning, and they're recognizing that there needs to be other ways that people should get access to that. And I'm doing a little bit of plug ourselves. We're an online training company, and then people are recognizing how awesome it is to be able to not go away for 5 days to be able to get training. And that's something that that we do see more of, and that we're happy that is happening. And the other trend that I'm seeing is me having to talk to a lot of different enterprises, how the difference of gap is between the haves and have not. I know that's a topic that we talk about a lot, but people who actually are very large organizations with large resources have an extremely sophisticated, not only cybersecurity defense, but a very robust education and workforce development. While people on the right side, who may be multi-billion-dollar companies, but they have, in some ways, and I hate to say this, no idea how to actually approach the discussions and the problems that we had at hand. So we're seeing a lot more of that. And I hope that actually gap, the other gap we're talking about, sort of that gets filled also quickly.
Right.
Yeah. One trend, I concur 100% with Jung's both points, especially the last one. Another area that I see as a trend is, you mentioned earlier, Mike, around AI and machine learning. And that is certainly a buzzword right now in the security field, as much as it's in everything else. And a lot of people right now are banking on how AI, machine learning, technology can actually help solve this people problem, because we can automate away all of our problems. And the trend that I see is that actually doesn't automate away the problem. It just transfers the problem to a different type of skill set. And so the trend is that, you can take some of the repeatable tasks and you can kind of apply some good data to them, but it just actually forces up the type of person that's doing the analysis and interpreting those results and that data in a way that's meaningful. And that's actually kind of making a more complex skill set in the process.
Right.
So we have this huge gap, and we're kind of, we're solving the problem on the automation side, but it's actually kind of creating a more robust purple unicorn, as you call them, of kind of what you need to do something with all that data.
Which is really interesting if you think about it as a training company or a learning company. In some ways, the easier training function is going to be supplanted by automation. And then the human skills, the things that are going to be uniquely human are going to be leveling up. So figuring out how to develop the training programs for the humans who are addressing that sort of leveled up ecosystem, it's going to be super interesting.
Yeah, Sam and Jung have their work cut out for them.
Any final thoughts, Sam?
Absolutely. I will kind of take Jung's first point, but add a level deeper to it. I think Jung is right, is that historically, cybersecurity is not taught very well. And finally, as an industry, not just CyberVista, we're paying more attention to how we actually teach cybersecurity. But this attention isn't always positive attention, meaning it doesn't lead necessarily to teaching it the proper way. And I think one of the trends that's interesting is this whole concept of like innovation, product innovation, how we teach innovation, and which is a word that's close to my heart because this is my job title. But I say one of the trends I guess I want to debunk is that it's not really a fancy word, right? It's basically just doing the right thing before you're forced to. And in our context of teaching, like simply innovation is asking ourselves, what's the best way to teach this? What's the best way to present this content? And the right answer is actually obvious. It's often obvious, and it's often very simple. And those two things are typically different from the norm. And, common synonym of innovation is creativity. Yeah. But I think the best form of creativity is actually, simplicity. So teaching and innovation and teaching well is actually often very simple.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because a lot of these fields, people are seeking out best practices, and reminds me of the quote, best practices are for amateurs. So like by the time you're defining the best practice, so it's like a hacker has figured out some new breach. So it's almost like teaching the mindsets and the ways of thinking, and not being too narrow and like functionally fixed in the way you think about understanding the problem space and the ability to solve problems. Yeah, I love the creativity stuff. Also, this was a wonderful conversation. So thanks very much to our friends from CyberVista, Simone Petrella.
Yeah.
CEO, Jung Lee, the Chief Product Officer, and Sam, I got your last name.
I'm the history major. That's it. That's all you gotta know.
Sam, the history major. Wonderful conversation. If folks want to learn more about CyberVista, where do they go?
Head over to cybervista.net or find us on Twitter at CyberVistaEd.
Yeah, excellent. And they're also at a lot of conferences, trying to engage other workforces, keep the conversation going, and we'll keep the conversation going here on Trending in Education. So thanks again for listening. You can find us on Twitter at Trending in Ed. Facebook is the same. We're getting active in LinkedIn. We're everywhere you can listen to podcasts. And thanks again for listening today. Cool.